Music reflects a thought process. Music reflects an emotional process. Music brings reflection for the listener, for the reader of it. For the active performer, it is more like a medium because the industry of playing overtakes the capacity of idle listening in contemplation of the polyphony, of the harmony, of the melody, of the rhythmicity, of the pulse. Or then the interpretation becomes a reflection upon the purpose of the composition. Not that we can determine it, but we can situate it not as a museum artifact, because after all, most of the music we play are by dead composers. Therefore, the ones we teach, the ones we record, the ones we promote, necessarily by conviction, sometimes by arbitrary obligation, because it's the repertoire of the instrument that is expected to be mastered. So there's a lot of expectation that every classical music student trained properly will find their own path in life as musicians. Sometimes they just don't, and they keep the music as a hobby, as too precious to be money earning time, because it's the time spent to master it is disproportionate to the time of hopefully mastering it, if ever. Therefore, an alternative profession providing livelihood allows to spend quality time for the purpose of the music itself, not in competing with each other, not in proving through the music your worth to colleagues or peers, but just simply exchanging the music score's discourse with your own individual acceptation of what is going on and how you evolve in your own life affects the way you perceive the music, or any art form for that matter. Some are more close to the innate understanding of it intuitively. Some need acquired taste, cultivated knowledge, stylistic awareness. In other words, refined comb of awareness of expectations. If not, you depend solely on the performers who will render it one way or the other. And if you don't have access by yourself to it, then you only depend on the way it's told to you by those who officiate as performers on behalf of the composers or their style, and what they represent in the history of music, and in which time period they composed it, and how we perceive it today compared to when it was perceived then, and therefore the informed interpretations according to the techniques of the time. One can beautifully do some kind of archaeological work in playing music of the past today, while bringing it to the reality of today, because after all, the psyche of the performer of a certain century is different from the one of those who played it or composed it when it was written. The sense of longing, of expectation, of delayed climax or avoidance of climax? And what is a tension and a release between a consonance and a dissonance? What is major and minor in mood setting? How much of it implies that? Changes through the centuries as well as through the sense of following the music polyphonically, monophonically. Music is a language, truly, but most people don't have the syntax or the grammar to approach it on their own. Just open the music score and hear it play through reading it in your head, just like you do for a book when you learn the language. Of course, you cannot do it in a foreign language that you don't know. And the translation then of a translator would interpreter would perhaps sway you in a way that the choice of the words were made other than the initial words, either to convey a sense, either to convey a specific hint that the word leads to other hints. All these innuendos are to do with the fact that interpretation, when you play for people who listen, therefore you read to them loud voice, so to say, the text of a book that they listen as an audiobook, so to say. If music is a language, and it is, not only to convey concepts, but also to convey atmospheres, therefore moods, as well as structure. That's why in the beginning I was addressing this about music conveying intellectual experience, mirroring one's past or one's subconscious or one's depth of reflection upon things, or one's reaction to things in terms of dance or sing or pray, or use music as a mirror of your soul towards what you apply for self towards. In a love song, in a prayer song, in a dancing song, you find so many aspects of the functionality of music, such as it's defined by its style, also by its genre. And if the music is complex, then it escapes to people who can't follow it other than if they're educated towards it. Same thing can be said about a book that's written in a very complex language, if it's a topic that is very niche or just in general. And perhaps you read it without understanding it fully or at all the different layers of infusion of the knowledge that you get from reading it, like you would do in a textbook that you're supposed to study from, memorize, and therefore bring out at an exam to show that you have memorized that acquired knowledge. In music, the more you analyze, the more you study, the more you organize your understanding about this or that, there is a layer of emotional content that shouldn't be touched by the analytical aspect of music making. Mademoiselle Boulanger never tried to define a music through its anatomic knowledge of how it's constructed by saying this is why it's beautiful, or this is how this composer reached this effect. You could say it on the surface, yes, the anxiety through syncopations, or perhaps a dance through hemiolas, in the pulse, in the rhythm. Yes, there are ingredients, but they're not necessarily defining patterns, because you could find examples to prove the contrary as well. But the observation of how something is made makes you be able to copy it, or perhaps rebuild it, or build it differently if you if you take it apart and you put it back together, because you're curious industrially to know how it's made, the industry of the making. How is a sonata built? How is a watch made? How is the car engine constructed? There are solid sciences and precise sciences for that. But there is a level in music of the construction, of the structure, of the phrasing, of the storytelling capacity that is hinted when there are no specific texts that the music is reflecting, but is just sounds per se, intervals, gestures, leaps, repeated notes, repeated patterns, thematic materials, elements that you recognize, elements that the composer combines in the development. So you attend the cooking of the meal before you eat it or taste it. Sometimes I find myself as a performer, also as a teacher, to be on the cooking side of the things. We take the ingredients, we put it together. Does it come up as a Beethoven or Schubert or Mozart sonata? Not really. You could make it look alike. It could be a pasticcio. It could sound like almost, I'm sure with AI, if you feed the computers the knowledge of a certain art form, they're going to come up with alternative versions of it. Will they be clones? Will they be alternative realities of what could have been done by the human brain had there not died and explored differently this, or perhaps they would have given up on this style and evolved in a way that you wouldn't expect it. Imagine late work by Chopin, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Mozart, who all died in their 30s. How do we know that their works in their 60s, had they lived, would have been the follow-up of the flow of their intellectual development? They might have questioned the whole system and come out with atonality or other forms of organization of the sounds. I find it fascinating because ultimately we deal today with music of the past that is an emanation of their intellect, even if it's strongly coated by their affect. Obviously, if it's a funeral march or a minuet, we understand the purpose, therefore the style. But even so, with the different cultures in European and extra-European cultures, a funeral procession doesn't take the same tempo or pulse or gravitas. It can be different. In New Orleans, they have funeral processions with 1930s jazz-style music, and not necessarily as Chopin style often played in situations like that funeral march. So it is true that a cultivated musician should be able to develop an awareness of the stylistic specificity, even within a country of a composers closely living in the same time period, like end of the turn of 19th, 20th century in France, Fauré, Debussy, Ravel, have nothing in common, really. I mean, of course, they are communalities by the essence of their using a form of development or evolution or alteration of the tonal system as a language, and perhaps the whole tone scale, and perhaps some elements that were in the air of the musical style evolution of the time in that area of the world. But within that, they developed very differently their expression, and that is almost as if they were foreigners to each other. So the communality between Haydn, Beethoven, and Mozart is obvious because of the first Viennese school, or Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern for the second Viennese school. But even in the case of my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, each of her students were nurtured by her to become themselves and not clones of her. No, that doesn't mean that some students who studied composition with Messiaen or Dutilleux in France, or studied with Copland, or studied with other composers, will not be drawn to imitate, like painters do when they go to study with a master. They first copy, imitate, and then learn their trade from it. Bach did that as an orphan by having a child access to few scores of music that he basically analyzed by himself. He was never having really a teacher, just some of his older cousins as mentors, tossing them from one family to the other because he was a so young orphan. And so he learned his trade, his skill. But then what he did with it was transcendental, way beyond what you expect from this Baroque music where court or church composers had to write obligational formal music. And they could have done it like Vivaldi did for concerti and so on. Bach with cantatas and Scarlatti with the esercizi, which we call sonatas. It could look like industrial quantity compared to, but of course it was manufactured, obviously, as well as very few are alike. Of course you have some communalities, but not much. Bach uses chromaticism and contrast in contrapuntal complexity with voice crossings and for things which had to be played and disposed right quickly, like a weekly cantata, and had to be written again the next week. So copying the parts, making the industry of composing it, let less the inspiration. And Schubert, who composed so many songs, quasi a few a day in his short life, were driven by something, all of them, that was more than them, beyond the trade that they gathered, either through studies or self-taught, like Schubert as well, Bach, just by observing and then developing it. And some needed to rethink the paradigm. I mean, for instance, Beethoven rejected Haydn's early classical sonata form by breaking the form into something different. Mozart never felt the need to it, at least not until he died at 36. Who knows if he would have or not later. It's a speculation, but in fact what I find out to be fascinating as a teacher, as a musician, as an aging musician with instructing young musicians is that music means so much differently to different people. The very same piece, just like the same instrument, different pianists play, they sound different. The same piece can mean differently to even very educated musicians and how they render it. So there is room for appropriation of the text, for the meaning of it, so that you don't just recite notes, but you end up by pronouncing them as written, like a theater or a film actor tells the lines. But you forget when you watch it, if it's a good actor, that they're telling lines. You start believing in the character and the fact that the character's text through them is not just puppets and from a puppeteer, but it's really they become the character, and therefore they bring alive the text, even if it's so well naturally said that you believe it's their own spontaneous speech. The chosen word, the chosen note, the chosen improvisational element, or the chosen modulation effect, or the chosen comment tone, in harmonic or not, are all different degrees of manipulating our emotional and psychological and intellectual contemplation of the music played for us, either as a music for film, either music by itself, creating an internal film that we imagine in our head, just like when we read a novel on our own, without a film director telling us what to imagine. I feel And I fear that music that only addresses the intellect bedazzles, amazes, respects, and brings admiration. 40 voice motet by Thalles, 6 voice Ricercar by Bach. But on the other side, they also wrote melodies that are unforgettable just for the simple beauty of a gesture of a few notes in a row, with or without words, or even without the words that originally were in an aria from an opera or a mass. And I find in the more I age that it's more like perfume than the essence of the person, the essence of the person, the soul of the person. Psyche or psyche, as the ancient Greeks determined the breath to be the siege of the soul that departs at death. I find it to be very much that too in music, as if we connect to their soul. Imperfectly, with more experience than less when you age, how we manage our own emotions and respond to it through stage fright or desire not to mess up something beautiful and meaningful. But when it's beautifully done, beauty is also in the eye of the beholder. It's something of a transcendental aesthetic element. It's something that we cherish because we put the value in it to cherish it. Is it because it's old, or is it because it's long, or is it because it makes us travel within ourselves, to dig within ourselves, like composers, I think, dig something from deep inside them, different layers of their consciousness, rather than just only make up organizing random thoughts or notes or pitches. That is the ultimate visual element that you can see on the score and that you can hear when you play it. And it's best to do it all by once, instead of having somebody to do it for you. But nevertheless, I find it very humbling to discover through other people playing of a piece that I might have played and thought I understood, or not understood, that's perhaps presumptuous, but that I got closer to it through at times, and it travels with me through life, and I rediscover it. It keeps on giving as a gift. And then somebody new, like a young student, comes in and plays it for you, and you see completely other things you never saw in it. So perhaps they're not authentic, perhaps you are not authentic, perhaps it doesn't matter ultimately if it's authentic, because it's outside of its time frame anyway. For the listener and the performer and the instrument and the acoustic and the expectations, what is Baroque today, or considered Baroque, was modern then, and not Baroque or Romantic or Classic. It's all organizations for studies that we put things in little boxes, but we have to think outside of the box, to be outside of the box, and to reflect what it means to us while we serve the muse, serving the muse outside of the box with respect, love, and care, as well as with unforgivable criticism for self-improvement towards the never-ending hope to play it well, perhaps someday, one day. And it's not only technical, but it is also for the muscular memory and the memory itself, but also is the management of it and how you organize the statement of that storytelling beyond its formal existence through your own path. It's not just an obstacles path. It's an allegory of life itself, a dialogue between voices in the polyphony, a solace or a longing through the mood, an excitement, an enticement, a drive, and then um, curiosity bringing you to search more about it and learn who others around that time did of that or differently, and how they approach the same genre and how it differs. And it's a rabbit hole, but it's wonderful, lifelong, and marvelment. Thank you.